Dr. Reed believes that each personality type has a unique way of leading that is all their own, and that effective leadership requires utilizing a wide range of behaviors and may require greater effort and concentration for some personality types than others. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to present you Dr. Hillary Reed.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. And I apologize if I'm not moving around too much. I have a stomach bug today that I'm trying to get over. Not a great day for that. So how many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator before? How many of you can tell me your 4-letter type? How many of you can tell me your preference clarity index? All right, great. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the different generations in the workplace and then the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So one of the first steps to leadership development is understanding yourself. So what is leadership? How about you guys call out a few words to tell me what leadership means to you? What was that one? Somebody said?
Inspirational.
Okay. Courage. What was that one? Inspiring. Anybody else? All right, if you do a Google search of leadership, as of last night, you're going to find about 1.6 billion results with different definitions of what leadership is. So what we're going to do today is, first thing that we're going to do is actually set a clear definition and standard for what leadership means. So for me, leadership is going to be defined as the act of motivating and inspiring others towards a common goal. So with creating and maintaining high-performance teams, it's a goal of every leader, manager, and supervisor. Leaders who are successful at creating high-performing teams can see higher retention rates, increased productivity, and more engaged employees. However, in today's multi-generational workforce, teams can be even harder to lead if a leader does not understand the differences among the multiple generations on his or her team. So in today's workforce, employees are choosing to stay longer and delaying their retirement. It's projected by the year 2024 that nearly 25% of the population is going to be over the age of 55. So times have changed, and you can now see 5 active generations in the workplace. This diversity can provide benefits in terms of the unique backgrounds and perspectives that the different generations bring to the workplace, but it can also lead to misunderstandings and conflicts, as the different generations can often struggle to understand each other, understand each other's working styles, communication styles, and even each other's values. So this next screen is going to be a little hard for you to read, so I'll go through it. So this shows a little bit of the characteristics and traits of the current 5 generations that we have in today's workforce. And it does not show up in this room at all. So the first generation that we have in the workplace right now, our oldest generation, is the generation called Silence, or our Traditionalists. This generation is born between 1928 and 1945. Their values are shaped by the Great Depression and World War II, rock and roll, and the nuclear families. Their aspirations were home ownership. Their communication styles are face-to-face communication, and some of their characteristics are they are considered the most loyal workers. They have a strong commitment to teamwork, emphasis on rules, and they command with a lead and control style. The next generation we have in today's workforce is the baby boomers. They're typically born between 1946 and 1964. And the ages, or the dates that these are born, can kind of vary based on who does the research. They typically vary by about 1 to 2 years. I typically go off the dates that the Census Bureau publishes, so that's where my data is coming from. The values for the baby boomers are typically shaped by the civil rights action in Vietnam and the Apollo moon landing. Their aspirations were job security. Their communication styles were preferably face-to-face, but they could do phone and email as well. And some of the characteristics are a high priority for work over family. They distrust and question authority, and were typically known as the me generation. The next generation in our workforce is the Gen X. This generation was born between 1965 and 1980. Their values were shaped by Watergate, the energy crisis, and dual income families. Some of their aspirations were work-life balance, and their communication styles were typically text message and email. Some of their characteristics are prefer independence and fewer rules. They're typically loyal to their profession and not necessarily their employer. Our next generation is our Gen Y, and our most recent in the workforce are Millennials. They're typically born between 1981 and 1996. Values were shaped by 9/11, the social media, reality TV, and a child-focused world. Aspirations were freedom and flexibility. Communication styles are typically online and mobile. And they were the first global-centered generation and our most educated generation currently in the workforce. They represent a more team-centric approach and take an entrepreneurial approach to the workplace. And our most recent generation that is really just entering our workforce is our Gen Z generation. And this generation was born in 1997 to our current population. Their values were shaped by global warming and the economic shutdown, producing their own media, cloud computing. Some of their aspirations were stability and security. Their communication styles were FaceTime or anything mobile. And characteristics, they have large networks but not as much work experience. They're technologically advanced and career multitaskers, typically moving from organization to organization. So like I said, this is just a few of the key traits for these generations. This does not overlap and show all of the different characteristics and traits of the 5 generations. So while understanding the differences of each of the 5 generations that we currently have in the workplace and the environmental factors that influence these generations is important, it's also important for leaders to understand the innate preferences that we're born with that can impact our communication and our personality styles. So Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist, suggested that the differences between people are not random. Jung's theory of personality suggested that the differences among people actually form patterns, or what we call today types. Jung observed that when people's minds are active, that they are engaged on one of 2 mental processes, taking in and gathering information or making decisions and coming to conclusions. So while we all have preferred ways of doing one of these processes, we have preferences for one over the other. So looking at the world from the standpoint of type can help us to build a framework for a deeper understanding of our own leadership styles and others' leadership styles from those around us. So how do we look at a world through a standpoint of type? By using the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator was created by Isabel Briggs Myers and Catherine Briggs to make Jung's theory of personality more useful in today's lives. So Jung believed that our preferences are innate and that we are born with these preferences. However, we often also realize that our preferences can be influenced by environmental factors such as life experience, culture, our family, and our education. And the Mbti indicator looks at those innate preferences, just strictly the ones that we're born with. It's not looking at those indicators and those preferences that may be influenced by our environment. So I'm actually going to have you guys do a quick activity that's going to help to illustrate our preferences. So if each of you have a piece of paper or a pen and something that you can write down on, I'm going to have you take that out and do a quick activity. All right, so I'm going to have you pick up your writing utensil, and I'm going to have you write down your name as many times as you can on a piece of paper in next 30 seconds when I say go. So if everybody has their pen and pencil out. All right, go. Stop. So now I'm going to have you pick up your writing utensil with your other hand and do the same thing. You're going to write your name as many times as you can in 30 seconds. And go ahead and go. All right, stop. All right, so some of you call out a few words. What did it feel like to pick up the pen and pencil with your first hand and write down your name? Comfortable? Natural? Easy? All right, when I had you switch hands and use your other hand, how did that feel? Awkward? Not easy? All right, so where do we get our preferences for using one hand over the other? We all can and do use both of our hands. However, when writing, one hand to us comes more natural and easier. We don't have to think about it. We can just pick up our pen and write. So by having hand preferences, we're able to respond to situations with our preferred hand without having to think and make a conscious decision about what to use. So if I was going to pick up something right now with my preferred hand, I don't have to think about it. I'm right-handed, so I can just pick it up and hold it. However, if I need to pick something else up and my right hand already has something in it, I have another hand that I can use. It's my non-preferred hand. I can still do it, and I can still pick up an object and hold it in my left hand. So we all have preferences, and preferences allow us to be more efficient in situations while knowing that I have an opposite hand, my non-preferred hand, or an opposite preference that I can use if my preferred preference cannot be used. You have another one that you can tap into. It may not be good as the first one, but it is something that you can use. So we all have preferences, just one of those preferences is stronger than the other. So when we're looking at the Mbti framework, the Mbti framework has 4 pairs of opposites, or what we call dichotomies. And these dichotomies characterize ways that we direct and receive our energy, take in information, come to conclusions, and make decisions. The Mbti indicates only your preference for doing certain things. It does not indicate your ability. It is not a measure of knowledge, skills, intelligence, or those abilities. There's no right or wrong to either of these preferences, and each one of the preferences is just a way of showing your normal and natural way of being. So your type results indicate your preference and how clear you are about your preference. They do not indicate how much of one preference you have over the other or how little of a preference that you might have. So what we're going to do is we're going to delve into each of the 4 dichotomies. And as I'm doing each of these dichotomies, I'm going to explain a little bit to you about them. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to write down your preference of one dichotomy over the other. And at the end, you're going to have kind of a guess as to what your MBTI type might be. So you'll have a 4-letter pair at the end of this presentation. So our first dichotomy is looking at extraversion and introversion. And this dichotomy looks at how we take, direct and receive our energy. So people who prefer extraversion direct their energy and their attention outwards towards the external environment, the people and the events around them. They're energized by taking action and interacting with other people. They tend to feel charged up and inspired when they spend time with other people. They like group and can often feel isolated if they're not spending enough time with other people and spending too much time alone. They're often drawn to the outside world and are expressive and sociable. And because of this, they prefer to communicate by talking and working things out verbally with other people. They like to solve problems by talking them through. They often have a broad interest in many things and learn best by doing before taking action. They readily take initiative and work in relationships and tend to act first before thinking. Extroverts are typically very open with their feelings and their thoughts, and because of this, other people think of extroverts as very easy to get to know. So a few of the keywords that we have that are typically associated with extroverts are action, outward, people, interaction, many, expressive, and they do first, think, and then do. So our opposite of extroversion is looking at introversion. So people who prefer introversion are typically thought of as quiet, reserved, and thoughtful individuals. They tend to direct their energy and their attention inwards towards their internal environments. They're energized by reflecting on their own and other people's thoughts, experiences, and memories. They're often drawn to their inner world and can be considered private and contained. And they typically communicate by writing and want to work ideas and problems out by thinking and reflecting on them. They think through their responses because their communication styles are very focused and considerate. And they can carry on conversations, but if a decision is required to be made in that conversation, they may need more time to reflect and think about it to weigh their options. They typically work best when they are alone, and their isolation allows introverts to focus deeply and produce high-quality work. They often have a small circle of friends, and a key to happiness for an introvert is high-quality relationships. So a few of the keywords that we use that are typically associated with our introverts are reflection, inward, privacy, concentration, few, quiet, and they like to think first, then they'll try something out, and then they like to think and reflect on it a little bit more. So this was a good cartoon that I found that perfectly describes our extroverts and our introverts. So we have our extrovert on the right who is bummed and sad, and he's saying, oh, I'm staying in tonight. And then we have our introvert on my left who is happy and excited, and he says, oh, I'm staying in tonight. So just an example of how the same sentence looks totally different for our extroverts and our introverts. So what I'm going to have you do on your paper right now, if you believe that you prefer extroversion, I'll have you write an E down on your paper. And if you believe that you prefer introversion, I'm going to have you write an I down on your paper. And as we're going through each of these dichotomies, you'll hear that I typically say prefer, prefer, prefer. Because with each of these dichotomies, you're picking the ones that you kind of naturally tend to. So at the end, you're going to have your 4-letter MBTI type, but this is not putting you in a box and saying that you can't be any of these other types. It's just saying these are the ones that you naturally go to. So we always say prefer, and these are the ones that you naturally go to. You are not an introvert, you're not an extrovert, you prefer that type of behavior. So the next one that we're going to look at is our second dichotomy, and this is looking at sensing and intuition. So this dichotomy looks at the way that we take in information and the kind of information that we trust and we rely on in order to be able to make decisions. So a person can rely primarily on the happenings through one or more of their five senses, or they can rely on the less obvious choice of looking at the meanings and the relationships. So people who prefer sensing are typically very focused. They focus on the present realities, verifiable facts, and their experiences. They're considered our here and now people. They often focus on what is real and what is actual. They observe and remember specifics, and they are factual, concrete, and sequential. They like to follow a step-by-step manner, so they're going to go through step 1 before going on to step 2, and then going on to step 3. They see things as they are because they're concrete and literal thinkers. They're factual and process information through their 5 senses. And people who prefer sensing build carefully and thoroughly to conclusions and through ideas. And they understand ideas through practical application. For them, and they are specific and literal and trust their experiences. If something didn't work the last 2 times that they tried it, it's not going to work this time for a sensor. Why would it work this time if it hasn't worked in the past? They go off of their experiences in the past. So sensors value realism and common sense. So a few of our keywords associated with sensing is facts, realistic, specific, present, keep, practical, and what is. So people who prefer intuition live in the future and are immersed in our world of possibilities, the big pictures, and the insights. They process information through patterns and impressions and meanings, and they remember specifics when it's related to a specific pattern. They relate to and are attracted to imagination and value inspiration. They gather their knowledge by reading between the lines. What isn't blatantly on the page, looking in between those lines. Their abstract nature attracts them to deep concepts and ideas. And people who prefer intuition move quickly to conclusions. They follow their hunches. Application for them is secondary. And they use metaphors, analogies, and trust their inspiration. So a few of our keywords at association with intuition are ideas, imaginative, general, future, change, theoretical, and what could be looking at those future possibilities. So here we have our sensors on the right and our intuitors on the left. Both of these people are given the same exact data, and they're reviewing the data in order to be able to make a decision. Our sensor on my right is saying, I'm going to need to see more data in order to be able to make his decision. While our intuitor on the left said, this looks like a great opportunity. So they're both given the same amount of data and information, but because of their personality types, one might need a little bit more information where the other one's ready to move forward. So while we can give sensors and intuitors the same picture to look at, another example, our sensors are typically going to look at the same, or the specifics in the picture. They're going to look at the people who are in the picture. They're going to look at the specific objects, the colors that are in the picture, and the shapes that are in the picture. And I actually did this with our cadet earlier today. When intuitors are looking at that same exact picture, your intuitors are going to come back and they're going to describe the big picture or the story behind the picture. They may not notice some of the details. They may not notice that there's a flower in the picture. They may not notice the color of the lady's dress that is in the picture, while our sensors are going to notice each of those fine details, but not see the overall big picture of the picture. So now on your paper, I'm going to have you write down an S if you prefer sensing. And for intuition, we actually use an N instead of an I because we use I for introversion. So write down an N if you prefer intuition. All right, our third dichotomy is designed to reflect a person's preference between 2 contrasting ways of making a judgment and coming to a conclusion. A person can rely on thinking if they want to decide impersonally on the basis of logical consequences, or they can rely primarily on feeling if they want to decide based on personal or social values. So people who prefer thinking make their decisions based on impersonal logic, objective logic. They may want to take a step back and take a step out of the situation when they're making their decisions. They analyze by using cause and effect reasoning, and they solve problems, and when they do solve a problem, they consider that problem to be solved and closed. They tend to see the world in black and white. If there are rules and standards, those rules and standards need to be followed by everybody. It shouldn't be different for one person than it is for the other person. Interacting with them can sometimes feel brief and businesslike, and they strive for an objective standard of truth. They can often be considered reasonable, tough-minded, and they consider themselves fair, and that they want everybody to be treated equally. They can sometimes be seen as cold and heartless by our feelers. So a few of the keywords associated with our thinkers are head, detached, things, objective, critique, analyze, and they're firm but fair. While our people who prefer feeling often like to step into the situation and consider the situation based on those people around them and how their decisions might impact those people who they're making their decisions for. They decide primarily through social considerations, they listen to their heart, and considers others' feelings. They may empathize with others and are guided by personal and social values and impact their decisions on others. They often strive for harmony in their personal interactions, and they may be considered compassionate and tender-hearted, but they also consider themselves fair, but they want each individual person to be treated individually. At work, they're sociable and person-oriented and may make their decisions based on values. So they may be seen as unreliable and emotional by our feelers. So a few of the keywords associated with with our feelers are heart, personal, people, subjective, praise, understand, and merciful. So an example of this, one of my old teams, not that I'm working with now, was 75% feeling and 25% thinkers. So I had a one-on-one meeting with every one of my employees on Monday mornings. And when we would come in on Monday morning, my thinkers would come in with their reports, they'd sit down, and they would be ready to go right away. They would be going down their numbers, talking about their meetings that they had for the week, going over their agenda for the week, and talking about the business at hand. When my feelers came into my office, they spent the first 20 minutes talking about their weekend and what was happening with their family and sharing what was going on this next weekend and what their vacations and plans might be. And I understood this about my team and that our feelers needed to have that connection and those relationships before we could jump into the business, and our thinkers on my team needed to get right down to business. Just so something a little bit for you to think about when you're dealing with different people on your team. And so this was a good cartoon that I found. We have our thinker on the left who is saying, cut the small talk, let's get on with it. And then we have our feeler on the right who's asking, how's the baby? How's your mother? How did you feel about yesterday's meeting? And that's a big key word where you kind of tell if somebody is a thinker or feeler, especially when you're leaving a meeting. Your feelers will often ask, how did you feel about that meeting, where your thinkers are going to be asking about the data and the content from that meeting. So I'm going to have you take out your pen again, and if you prefer thinking, you'll write down a T, and if you prefer thinking, I'll have you write down an F. Our final dichotomy of judging and perceiving is designed to identify a process that a person tends to deal with our outer world and the extroverted part of their life. People who prefer judging typically want their external world to be organized and orderly, and they look at the world and see a world that needs to be organized. While our people who prefer perceiving seek to experience the world and not have it organized. They look at the world and see options that need to be explored. So for people who prefer judging, they're often considered organized, systematic, and methodical. They approach life in a structured way, creating plans and organizing their world. They're self-disciplined and decisive, and they seek closure in their decisions. When they ask for things, they're very specific in what they're asking for. They make short-term and long-term plans and follow those plans. So your judges are typically those people who have their to-do lists and like to go through their to-do lists every day, and they're crossing things off of their to-do list as they get done with them. So at work, they decide quickly and clearly and then work to get the job done, meeting deadlines and meeting goals. They like to have things decided, and they resist opening decisions. Once they've come to a conclusion, that's the end of the conversation. Let's move on to the next topic. They don't want to come back and open up that topic again. And they try to avoid last-minute stresses. So for them, opening up a topic or changing a last-minute deadline or changing a schedule on them is going to cause a last-minute stress. So perceivers may see them as rigid and opinionated. So keywords associated with our judging are organized, decision, control, now, closure, deliberate, and plan. While people who prefer perceiving are adaptable and curious, casual, and open-ended. Perceivers perceive structure as more limiting than enabling. They prefer to keep their choices open so they can be careful to address any challenges that life might send their way. They adjust flexibly to new information and changes and like to explore their options and resist cutting off their options and making decisions too soon. They get their sense of control by keeping their options open and making choices only when the choice is necessary. At work, they tend to avoid putting off decisions, and like most, the exploration of problems and situations. They may feel energized by last-minute stresses, last-minute changes, and last-minute additions to their schedule. Some judges may see them as aimless drifters. So a few of our keywords for our perceivers are flexible, information, oops, sorry, wrong one. Are flexible, information, experience, later, options, spontaneous, and wait. So here we have our judger on the right who has gotten everything out of their inbox, so they've gone down their to-list for the day, glad that's finished. And we have our perceiver on the left who is just getting started on their inbox, but they have plenty of time to get it done. One example of this that I like to use, so my husband and I, when we go on vacations, and he knows this about me, so I'm not hiding it from him anymore. When we go on vacations, I'm very much a J. I like to plan and organize our vacation. I know exactly what time we need to leave the house in order to get to the airport on time. I've read all about my vacation ahead of time. I have my book with each of the things that I want to see labeled in my book. I know exactly where it is, what day it's going to be open, and what time I need to be there in order to get to see it, and what street we need to walk on to get there. When he goes on vacation, he just wants to know where we're going and to have a good time while we're there. So when I take him on vacation, we just happen to be walking down the right street at the right time, so I get to see what I want to see, and he just thinks we just had a great time and got to be there when we got to be there. So it works great for our vacations. All right, so for this last dichotomy, I'm going to have you write down a J if you prefer judging, and a P if you prefer perceiving. So while we all do the opposites that I've described, I know some of you are probably struggling with saying, oh, I do both of these. When we're looking at your personality type and your preferences, type is about what you prefer. It is not about what you do and the behaviors that you do. So when we're looking at this and choosing one or the other, think about what comes automatically and what is natural to you. For me, for example, I am very much an introvert. I would prefer the one-on-one communications and having conversations with a few people at a time. But all of my jobs have required me to be an extrovert, be out in front of large groups of people and talking to large groups of people. It's definitely not my preference, but my job requires me to do that. So that's the behavior that I portray, is getting out and talking to large groups of people. But when I get home at the end of the day, my radio's off, my bedroom door is shut, and nobody can talk to me for the first couple hours at home because I need to re-energize myself because I've been exhausted by being an extrovert all day. So think about that as you're going through these. This is about your type preference and not the behaviors that you portray. So knowing each of these preferences allows us to know which behaviors are going to be easier for you and which ones are going to be more challenging and may require more development. So when we're looking at the 16 different personality types, your 4 pairs of dichotomies combine into 16 different patterns, or what we call types. Your 16 different types are put together in what we call a type table, which is displayed up here on this screen. So each 4-letter type represents one of 16 ways of being normal. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator only looks at normal behaviors. So within each of the 5 different generations that we currently have in the workplace, we have 16 different personality types represented in each one of those 5 different generations. With this knowledge and understanding of the 5 generations and the 16 different personality types represented with each generation, leaders can adapt their behaviors and their communication styles and their leadership styles in order to adapt to their team members and vice versa. So when we're doing this, this is called flexing your style. And this is a term that's used within Myers-Briggs, and now all leaders and managers must be able to flex their style. So flexing your style is a term that describes what happens when a person needs to access a preference that is outside of your 4-letter type. So each of you on your paper right now should have 4 letters, and that's your 4-letter type. And again, this is just a guess at your 4-letter type. It is not the official assessment. So we've all experienced flexing our type. And this kind of flexing can be hardest for people in times of need. So flexing can also happen when a person is in an environment long-term that is not conducive to their personality type. This is often an area where individuals think, oh, I'm doing this behavior. This behavior must be equal to that of one of my personality types. When in reality, the chances are good that using their non-preference or types outside of their preference is going to leave behind telltale signs of tiredness. That's the number one thing that you're going to experience. So working out of your type for any length of time almost always leads to a little bit or a lot of tiredness. Working out of your 4-letter type, that's the type you have on your paper, over a long period of time can lead to stress. It can even lead to a hatred of the work environment that you're in and a feeling of being misunderstood and not knowing why you're misunderstood. So it's important to remember that your preferences do not change, but you can change your behaviors once you know what your preferences are. So in order to be an effective leader, you must be able to use a variety of behaviors and focus on a wide range of issues. Leaders who cannot flex their style and adjust to meet the needs of others will struggle while they're in the leadership arena. Who we are is defined by our personality preferences, influences which essential leadership behaviors are going to come naturally to you versus those leadership behaviors that are going to take more time to develop, more time to create, and more time to work on. So I encourage you to use your MBTI types to become more successful by leveraging those leadership behaviors and natural talents that you had, and then addressing any gaps that you have in your leadership skill set by realizing your 4-letter type. All right, so I am open to answering any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you. Here's the million-dollar question. Does any of the generational groups fit into any specific or more prevalent of the 16 different categories?
Not as of the most research that's been done. So for example, my type is an ISFJ. There's an ISFJ in Gen Z, Gen X, Gen Y, baby boomers. So right now, with the most recent research that's come out by MBTI, there isn't more of one type in each generation. All 16 types are represented across the board. The one thing that is standard across the board, and this is the research that's come out, I know just off the top of my head, my personality type is only 6% of the population. So that number doesn't change within the generations, it just changes across the whole nation, or the whole population. There was someone
Yeah, my question's similar or related. If there are percentages for each of those types within one society, do they change from culture to culture?
They change from outside of the US, yes, they do. I don't have that specific data, but they do change outside of the US, yeah. One thing that they also change across is job types as well. So typically in high-level leadership positions, your CEO and C-suite employees, the largest personality type that's represented is your ESTJs. And we also see that, so I do leadership programs, and we have a leadership program for young professionals and then a leadership program for C-suite employees, and they are probably 70 to 80% of our applicants are ESTJs for both of those programs. Anybody else? Go ahead.
How do you design a team around those personalities that you choose weekly?
You don't. What you do is, so my team members, Myers-Briggs has a little tower that you can put on your desk and it shows your MBTI type. So my team, we actually do specific meetings based around our MBTI type, so we all know what each other's MBTI types are, and know where some of our weaknesses might be and where the other team members can stand in to help out with those weaknesses. So if we're working on a project that's going to require a lot of details up front, I'm going to put my S's to work in the beginning. If we have last minute changes and additions that are going to happen with this project, I'm going to tap in my J's because they are the ones that work best with those last minute stretches, those last minute changes. So that's when they're going to do their best work. So you don't really design your team around it, but once you know your team's MBTI type, that's when you tap into each person's strengths and know when to put them to work and what situations to specifically put them in so your entire team is successful. But yeah, with personality assessments, you cannot use them for hiring practices, but once you know their type, you know where to put them to work.
Do these types change as you get older?
They typically do not, but that doesn't mean that they don't. So I have been an ISFJ since I took my first assessment 11 years ago. The only time that they're really going to change is if you have a major life experience. In 1 year, I got engaged, got my Ph.D., my dad passed away, and so I took the assessment again to get my certification, and it came back as an ISTJ. And so I went and talked to the instructor. I said, I'm not a T, I'm an F. I've always been an F. That's, I'm always thinking of the individual. And she said, well, you really need to go home and think about it because you've had some major life experience. Something has impacted you that's made you change your type. So that I went back and thought, well, I have had kind of an exhausting year. So typically over time, your 4-letter is not going to change. But what you guys, if you do the official assessment, you get your 4-letter, and then you also get what's called a preference clarity index, and that's a little number that goes along with your letter. The number can range from 1 to 30. That's what could change over time, because as you get older and move up into careers, you're learning how to flex your style and use the other side of the dichotomy a little bit better. So your number may come down a little bit because you're able to flex. I'm a 30 on 3 of my 4 letters, so I'm definitely not going to change over time, but that's typically what would probably change over time. So. One thing though that will change is which of your 4 letters you use most over time. When you're a young professional, you're going to use your, and we don't have enough time to go into it today, but there's an auxiliary, a tertiary, there's 4 different letters that you use the most in your 4-letter type. And when you first learn your type, you're going to use your dominant type first, your dominant letter first. As you get a little older into your career, you're going to go to your secondary. As you get a little older in your career, you're going to be able to use your tertiary, which your tertiary is typically the one that you don't want to use, but as you get older, you're going to be able to use it a little bit more, and then finally you're going to be able to use your auxiliary. So each of your letters will you get used to using all of them and not just specific ones as you get older. Any other questions I can answer for you? Yeah.
What kind of correlation between parents and kids do you see?
I haven't really looked at any research on that, so I couldn't answer that for you. Where that would come in, though, is that's looking more at the environmental factors and how your parents are influencing you, and the MBTI does not look at how your type is impacted by the environment. It is looking at those innate preferences that you're born with. So, but I haven't really looked at much research on that. And I apologize, it was very short today, and there's so much that you can do with the Myers-Briggs, and there's so much information. It literally could be an 8-hour session that you could go into, so you guys really just got the very top level of this today. So I'd be happy to go into any more detail with people afterwards if you have more questions or want more information. Is there any other questions? All right, thank you guys.